Okay, let's move to the next speaker of this session. David Deming is an economist who studies education, skills, inequality, and the future of work. His early career research focused on the long-run impact of schooling on later life outcomes. More recently, David has become interested in how work is changing to place greater emphasis on soft skills such as teamwork, social perceptiveness, decision-making, and adaptability. In 2022, David was awarded the Sherwin Rosen Prize for outstanding contribution to labor economics. Please welcome David Deming.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so I want to start with two apologies. Okay, so the first apology is, when I accepted the offer to speak here, I had very high hopes that I could attend the whole conference and see all the papers. And then in between, I accepted a new job, which is starting July 1st. I'm the dean of Harvard College, which is a pretty busy job, as I've learned. And so I apologize that I can't come for longer. I promise you I'd like to. It's sort of this and that are sort of completely orthogonal, I still identify in my soul as a researcher, even though I'm deaning, and so this is pure consumption value for me. So I'm sorry to you, but also sorry to myself that I can't participate in it more. Okay, and then the second apology is that on the program, it says I'm presenting a paper called How People Use ChatGPT, and I am presenting that paper, but I thought it would be interesting not only present that paper, but to present it in the context of some other work on AI that I've done and try to kind of put it in slightly broader perspective for the audience. Okay, so I will talk about that work. Happy to answer more questions about it afterwards, but I won't only talk about that work. Okay, all right. So I'm going to talk about a bunch of papers. So one is a paper that I wrote with Alex Bick and Adam Blandon called The Rapid Adoption of Generative AI, and this is our effort to stand up a nationally representative survey to measure and track the use of AI in the US economy over the last couple of years. So I'll talk about that. It's an ongoing effort. Second paper is the one I mentioned. It's How People Use ChatGPT. This is a paper that I wrote with a bunch of OpenAI researchers that uses internal data from ChatGPT, the consumer plans, to try to understand how people are using this technology and what it might mean for the economy and for society. And then the third paper is a paper that I wrote with Chris Ong and Larry Summers called Technological Disruption in the Labor Market, which is much more of a macro perspective on what AI might do. The idea is to say, look, actually, even if AI is going to be tremendously disruptive, we've actually seen this movie before. There have been other major technological events in the US economy over the last 150 years or so: electricity, steam power, the personal computer, the internet, and those things were pretty big deals. And so if AI is on that scale, what might we expect? Okay, and then I'll talk a little bit about, I'll just speculate it responsibly. We'll do it together. Okay, so first paper, AI use in the real-time population survey. Why do we call it this? Well, it's an intentional analog to the current population survey, both in name and in function. What we do essentially is we stand up a pretty large survey. It's not as big as the CPS. CPS, if you don't know, is the largest and I would say most widely accepted source of labor market information, at least public source in the US. It's the source of the monthly jobs report, the unemployment rate, things like that all come out of that, and it moves markets, so it's a very big deal. And what we did was stand up an online survey. When I say mimic it, meaning like we actually replicated the question wording, the ordering, the flow, basically everything about the CPS. And the CPS is a quite baroque, complicated survey, because when you're asking people about whether they're unemployed, you have to understand whether they're looking for work, how long they've been looking for work, et cetera. And there's a lot of questions about how many weeks in the last year you've worked and so on. So we just quite literally replicated it. And then we added a bunch of questions at the end about AI. And the reason we did that was because we'd like to run the thought experiment. Suppose the actual CPS asked these questions, what would they find? Okay, and because we replicated all the aspects of the CPS design, we can assess whether our survey population looks like the CPS population. And when it doesn't, we can actually weight it to match the different moments of the data, demographics, things like weeks worked, hours worked, the income distribution, et cetera. So we can weight it in a bunch of different ways to basically make it perfectly match the CPS sample. Okay, and if I had more time and the talk was wonkier, I would show you some figures that essentially convince you, I think, that we were able to do this successfully. Okay, and so what we've been doing is we've been tracking this every 3 months since the summer of 2024, way back in the bygone days. And we've been doing it every 3 months, and we're going to continue to do it. And we're eventually, I think probably in the next month, going to release a public tracker that makes this data available, and people can use it, and we'll be adding questions and things like that. And I should say, it's kind of funny because started doing this in summer 2024, and way back then, we fielded a pilot survey, and the numbers came back like so high that I thought there was something wrong. And so so the first pilot survey was in June, and then we did another survey in August, and then it's been every 3 months since then. It turns out nobody questions them anymore, but it's kind of a funny exercise to go through it. And we did all these things like the questions, we'd ask people, do you use AI, yes or no? And so we switched the wording to no or yes, because sometimes people just click the first thing, and all kinds of stuff like that to try to make sure, because we just didn't believe how high the numbers were, but now it's kind of not as interesting. But anyway, okay, so let me just show you how we ask about AI use, because the reality is we're kind of all using it, even if we don't realize it. When your phone uses autocomplete, that's a form of AI, right? And then now, if you just do a web search, you're going to get an AI-infused answer from Google automatically. So the question is, what do we call AI use? And here's our definition. Here's what we say to people. We say generative AI is a type of artificial intelligence that creates text, images, audio, or video in response to prompts. And we give some examples. Those are the examples we gave in 2024. They'd probably be different now. But the point is, we're calling AI use some type of program, some type of interface, right? So like you go to ChatGPT or you go to Claude to use it, not like you're just getting AI answers automatically. So that's our definition of it. It's obviously going to get harder and harder to define when people are using AI, the more ubiquitous it becomes in our economy. So then we ask people, have you heard of it? Yes or no? No or yes. And then we say, do you use it for your job? These are not the only questions we ask, but they're just a representative sense. Do you use it for your job? If you do, which of the following products do you use? And then we put that in random order. And then we ask questions like, did you use it for your job last week? Because that's the way the CPS asks questions too. And then if you did, how many days in the last week, et cetera. So that's how it proceeds. And we kind of write the questions to look like CPS questions in all ways that we can. Okay, so what do we find? These are the data that's combining the two waves we've already done in 2025. Okay, and so overall, about 51% of working age adults say that they use generative AI. About 35% are using it at work, 45% outside of work. The union of those two is overall, so that's why it's larger. So if you say yes to either one of them, you're in that top category. So what you see is that usage is actually more common outside of work than at work. But right now, about a third of working age adults are saying they use AI. Again, these numbers were something like 40% a year ago, so it's gone up a lot in the last year. But I think now people are much less surprised because when it was 40% in 2024, people were quite surprised. Okay. So you might be interested to ask, well, is this survey really representative? You might not be convinced by me just saying it was. So what we do is we can, in particular, this survey is an online survey. Not everyone has access to the internet or easy access to the internet, and obviously if you don't have the internet, you can't use AI. So this Pew survey that we look at asks about ChatGPT. They don't ask about AI. So what we're doing is looking at the subset of people who use ChatGPT to compare it to Pew. And the Pew survey is address-based. So what they do is they sample postal addresses. And if you don't have the internet, they will drive to your house and show up with an iPad and have you take the survey. Okay, so about 3% of the country doesn't have an internet connection. Okay, so when we compare Pew's measure of whether you've ever used ChatGPT to our measure of whether you currently use it, so it's not exactly the same question, we find pretty similar results for the periods of time where there's overlap. Okay. And if you just want to get another comparison from internal data, this is weekly active ChatGPT users on consumer plans. This is from the internal data from the second paper I mentioned. And this is smoothed, but what you see is that basically you go from no users, this is November 2022 when ChatGPT was released, to about 100 million at the beginning of 2024. And then you can see the exponential curve start to increase. And as of September 2025, it has about 780 million active users globally. That's about 10% of the world's population. Okay, so about 10% of the world's population are using ChatGPT weekly, which is really explosive growth in even just the last year. Okay. Another thing that's interesting from this ChatGPT paper is that we can look at cohorts a bit, so we can break down how much of the growth is on the extensive margin, meaning like adding new users, versus increases in the intensity of usage for people who've had it for a while. So what these lines are doing is it's showing you for each kind of synthetic cohort, if for people who signed up for ChatGPT basically at the beginning, these are the power users, what's the increase in total message volume for that consistent cohort of users, and then so on. So what you see is most of the total growth, which is the black line, that's just growth in message volume. Most of that is new users, but every cohort is actually using it more than they were when they started in the aggregate. Okay, and right now, ChatGPT users are sending about 2.78 billion messages per day. That's about 32,000 messages per second. Another way to look at this is to just break this down into messages per weekly active user. So what you see here is that the yellow line, that's the top line, is the early adopters. Right? You see that they're sending a lot of messages, each week or something at the beginning, and then it kind of levels off in 2024, and then it starts to increase. And what you see, which is a very interesting pattern that begs for an explanation, you see that for all the cohorts, regardless of whether they sign up, basically the same usage pattern, which is it's flat through 2024, and then it starts to increase in early 2025 for all of them. So what that says to me is that this is not a cohort effect, this is a time effect, right? All cohorts, regardless of when you signed up, are using it more. So it could be that the model is getting better. It could be that the interface is getting better, or it could be that something in the zeitgeist says it's okay to use AI and people are using it more. We don't know, but it's very much a time effect and not a cohort effect. So I think that's pretty interesting. Again, and that suggests that people are using it more the longer they use it, which I think augurs well for the continued growth and adoption of the technology, for better or worse. Okay, so how does generative AI compare to past technologies? Well, the virtue of doing this, using this approach in the RPS that I mentioned, is that the CPS also asked questions about usage of past technologies, the personal computer and the internet. And so what we're going to do is try to put these on the same scale by measuring the speed of adoption relative to the first mass market product of each technology. Okay? So for the PC, we're going to call that 1981, which is the release of the IBM personal computer. That's the first personal computer to sell at least 1 million copies. We're going to say that's the beginning of the PC revolution, 1981. Okay? Now, for the internet, we're going to call it 1995. And that's two things happened in 1995. One is the NSF-net, which was the government supercomputer network that was the early foundation of the internet, was decommissioned and opened up to commercial usage. And then also that's the year that Netscape IPO'd. Okay, so we're going to call 1995 the beginning of the internet. And by the way, I asked ChatGPT if these were good dates, and it said yes. Okay. All right, and then for the beginning of generative AI, we're going to call that November 2022. That's the release of ChatGPT. Okay, so we're going to use our data and compare it to CPS data in something called the Computer and Internet Use Supplement, where they ask questions from starting in 1984 about PCs. Do you use a computer for your job? Do you use a computer at home? And then the CPS also asked questions about the internet. They didn't separate between at work or at home, but they say, do you use the internet? And then because it only starts in 97, we're going to supplement that with some data from the ITU, which is basically using broadband subscriptions combined with survey data to try to track this all across the world. This is a World Bank affiliated survey. Okay, so we're going to try to put all of them on the same scale and measure adoption relative to the beginning. Okay, so I want to say before I show you this that it's not like we're trying to make some deep comparison about the value of these technologies. In some sense, they build on each other, right? You can't use AI unless you have an internet connection, and you can't use the internet unless you have a computer. And so, and the computer is an expensive piece of hardware. So it's not like they're all the same. It's more just to get a sense of, is this going to be, in some ways you should think, well, computers and the internet are a completely pervasive and ubiquitous feature of our lives today. They're everywhere. You can't even ask questions about whether you use the internet. So many people use it. It's in your pocket. So it's kind of silly to even ask, are we going to get there with AI? Okay, and I think basically the answer is yes. Okay, so these blue dots are our actual data from the RPS. We don't have a line yet, in case it's only 2 years, but eventually it'll be a line. And then the red boxes are our computer usage, and the green is the 2 internet surveys. So what you see here is, again, just to think about this is computer use in the CPS starting in 1984. That's 3 years after the IBM PC, so we date that as year 3. In that year, about 20% of people were using a personal computer. So that's pretty rapid adoption. 3 years after the IBM PC, 20% of Americans were using a computer. And then you see what it increases until they stopped asking the question. It's not that it stopped, it's that computers became so pervasive that people said, well, we don't even bother anymore, CPS stopped asking the question. And then if you look at the internet, you could see it was even more rapid, right? 3 years after, you got something like 30% of people were using the internet, and then it very quickly increased to 70%. And within a couple of decades, it was everywhere. What you see is that AI usage is actually so far above both of those lines. It's been faster than the other 2, which again, I'm not trying to say it means AI is better than the internet in some weird sense. It's more that like it's on track to basically be everywhere so that these surveys won't even make sense within a decade or 2. Now, one interesting feature about this technology is that AI use, again, is much more prevalent at home, and that is actually a distinctive feature of it relative to computers. So we can't measure this for the internet, but if you look at computers, you can see that work usage was still lower than AI, but the difference is much smaller. If I showed you home usage, it would just be hugely different. So very few people had an IBM PC at home in 1984, but a lot of people have the internet at home in 2025. Sorry, AI at home in 2025. And again, that's related to, I think, these companies' intentional decision to make it super accessible and cheap and available on your computer. Okay. So how much are people using it? Well, move over here, I'm echoing. So this is where we ask this question, how many days each week do you use it? Do you use it every day? Do you use it more than one day, but not every day, once a week, and then like you use it, but only occasionally? And you see there's a pretty wide distribution overall, right? But you could think about this 12% overall, so roughly 1 in 8 Americans are using AI every day, okay? And you can see here that work usage, it's less common overall, but it's more intensive, so the everyday at work is higher than the everyday outside of work. But there's a pretty wide distribution for both. So we can put these numbers together and kind of make some assumptions on the bounds of them and estimate that somewhere between 13 and 18% of all work days, it's a second bar, in the US involve the use of generative AI. Okay? And then we can ask the question, well, on the days you used it, how much did you use it? And so we say, on the days you used it, did you use it less than 15 minutes, 15 minutes to an hour, 1 to 3 hours, 4 hours or more? Okay? You see, again, the very wide distribution overall. About 10% of people are using it 4 hours every day. And then obviously the intensity of usage is highly related to the frequency of usage. So about a quarter of the people who used it every day are also using it 4 hours or more on the days they used it, on those days. So these are the power users, right? And there's a bunch of people who use it only very occasionally. So we can put these numbers together and again, you look at the upper and lower bounds of these ranges and estimate that somewhere between 2 and 8% of all work hours in the US are spent using generative AI. Now, I don't know if you think that's a big number or a small number. I think it's a big number because there's a lot of jobs where you're not even in front of a computer all day. You're not really using the internet at all. And so for those jobs where you're a laptop junkie, the number's probably a lot higher. Okay, and again, this is only 3 years after the release of ChatGPT. So then we can put that together. We can look at variation by occupation. And you can see there's huge variation, right? So for computer and mathematical occupations, 63% of workers are using it. And they're using it on average for about 10 to 11% of all work hours. Okay, so that's a pretty high share. And you see there's a lot of variation by occupation, but I look at this chart and I think actually it's fairly widely spread across the economy at this early stage. If I showed you this chart for computers, it would be much more heavily concentrated in computer and math occupations, not surprisingly, and in administrative assistants and secretaries, which is office and administration. But you wouldn't see a lot of PC use in these other jobs just yet. Actually, if you look here, look, for example, at blue-collar occupations, 27% of blue-collar workers say they use AI, and they're using it for 3.7% of all work hours already. So that's a lot, in jobs that we don't typically associate with digital technology or AI, et cetera. So I think it's pretty widespread across the economy. That's my read of this. Okay, and then the last question, which is very highly related to the potential productivity impacts of AI, is how much time does it save you? Okay, and that's a tricky question to ask, right? How do people know how much time it saves them? So the way we ask this question is we say, okay, when you were using AI, how much longer would it have taken you to do the things you were doing if you didn't have it? Okay, that's the most concrete we feel we can make it. So, take this with a grain of salt. It's people estimating it, but we think it's informative nonetheless. Okay, so how much time do people report that they save, per week? And you see, again, pretty broad distribution. About a quarter of people are saying it's saving them 4 or more hours per week. Some people are saying it's not really saving me that much time. And then reassuringly, how much time you think it saves you is very related to how much you use it. So for people who use it every day, 36% say it saves them 4 or more hours. Okay, so we put all this together, combine this, how much time does it save you, with how much you use it, and we can get an estimate of the time saving equivalent. And we estimate that users save a time equivalent of 5.4% of all work hours. So you think like on a 40-hour work week, that's about 2.5 hours, right? And then 1.4% if you include people who don't use the technology at all. Right, so again, that's saving, like if it's 1.4%, it's saving about 1 hour a week overall in the economy, which is a pretty big number, I think. So then finally, we feed this into the machine, okay? And we say if it's 2 to 8% of all work hours, and then we write down a very simple model of the aggregate economy, and then the statistical wizardry and unverifiable assumptions happen. And our estimates imply that each hour spent using generative AI improves productivity for workers by about 33%. Okay. Now, an interesting thing about that number is that other folks have looked at a bunch of randomized controlled trials or quasi-experiments of time savings from AI usage. So treatment group that has AI, control group that doesn't, and they find that it's saving, the productivity gains are about 25% in those studies if you just take the median estimate across them. So it's not that far off from the 33% we got just using a completely different method, which is just asking people how much time they're saving. Okay, so 25, 33, something like that. You can feed either one of those into the machine. You can adjust it by the labor share because not every, you're trying to look at total factor productivity. A lot of that's capital and not labor, so it doesn't apply. So when you adjust it by the labor share, you estimate that generative AI increases potential productivity by about 2% right now, which is a big number, right? Because average labor productivity is something like 2%. So it could, but it's a potential productivity. Why do I say that? Well, the only reason it's actually going to increase productivity is if it actually translates into changing expectations at work, right? And I don't think it is yet, because even though we find that a third of workers are using AI, if you look at firm adoption of AI, it's much smaller, 7%, 6%, depending on the data. And so what that tells me is that a lot of AI usage is informal. Your employer's not prohibiting it. They're not encouraging it either. They're saying, okay, David, write this memo. David Otter, not David Deming. I don't want to work. Write this memo, have it on my desk in 2 days, because that's your standard expectation. And instead, you use AI to help you, and you get it done in 4 hours instead of 2 days, and you go to the pub, right? And so that's a welfare gain. That's a real productivity gain, but it's not going to translate into measured productivity unless the employer starts to say, okay, actually, stop slacking off. I need it in 4 hours instead. And I want you to write me 4 memos instead of 1, right? And that hasn't happened yet in a world where only 7% of firms have even adopted AI, and so that's kind of still yet to play out, and it's going to depend. So that's why I say potential productivity gains, because you have to lay it on top of all kinds of institutional factors, which are how are firms adopting this, how are they changing their workflows, how are they changing hiring, and that is still very much TBD. Okay? All right, so how are people using AI? Well, here's our way of figuring out all the different ways people use AI. So the reality is you look at people's messages, and they're asking AI for a lot of different things. Okay, so how do you classify this? And the way we did this was we actually trained a classifier. Okay, so we used, for reasons of time constraints, we're classifying hundreds of millions of messages. We used GPT-5 mini, I think, or maybe it was 4.0 mini. And we trained a classifier to look automatically at people's messages in a privacy-preserving way. So we never looked at anybody's messages. We just said, hey, here's a classifier, train it on people's message data, and then tell us what the conversation was about. And to be specific, what we did was we chose a random message in a conversation thread from somebody, and then we told the model, classify this message, but use the previous 10 messages as context. Why? Because sometimes when you're having a conversation with ChatGPT, it's like, yes, no, I want something better, and you can't really tell from the one message what it's about. So we said, classify this message, but classify it in the context of the previous 10 messages. Okay, so that's the actual method we used. And then we divided it into 7 bigger categories, which themselves are aggregates of a couple dozen categories that I'll show you in a second. So here are the 7. The biggest 2 categories are what we call practical guidance and seeking information. Now, you might ask the question, what is the difference between these 2 things? Here's how I think about it. Seeking information is the closest analog we have to traditional web search. This is looking for information that's either factual and verifiable, or it's the kind of thing that is going to give you the same output regardless of who's asking. So it's like, who was the 16th president of the United States? What's the capital of Mongolia? What's the cheapest underwear I can buy that whatever fits me? I don't know. Like things that are just, there's an answer and there's no interaction between you and the model. And so you could potentially get this with web search. Practical guidance is like that, but it's much more interactive and it's much more customized. So it could be, I'm a 60-year-old male who's recovering from a hip injury. Write me a workout that's going to get me back in shape in 6 weeks. Here's my 5K time, right? And so that's something you can't get from traditional web search. You have to give the model some inputs to get some outputs, and you can modify it. You can have an exchange, right? So it could be, and actually the largest subcategory within practical guidance is tutoring and teaching. So teach me this new concept, where how the model teaches you depends on what you know, and you have a dialogue where you reveal what you know, and then you get information filled in. So that's practical guidance. The third big category is writing. And so that's not just ChatGPT, write me something. That's also modify, edit, critique, translate, summarize existing text that is given by the user. It turns out actually about 2/3 of writing is that. So it's mostly not people asking to have something written for them, but rather asking for modification, advice, translation, et cetera, of existing text. So, translate this into Russian, or write this in the style of Ernest Hemingway, or make my op-ed 100 words shorter, or whatever it is. Okay? And so those 3 categories are really the big 3. They are accounting for about 3/4 of all overall usage. And then there's 4 smaller categories, multimedia. Well, you can see the big bump. This is the Studio Ghibli bump, right? So creating images, when ChatGPT released image creation capabilities, you saw a big bump. What we call self-expression, which does include the notorious therapy and relationships category. That's about 2% of overall usage. And then something we call games and roleplay and greetings and chit chat. Okay, so this is kind of like a catch-all category, which seems to have no obvious purpose. People are just talking to it. And then other unclassified, and then the category that actually is the focus of a lot of attention, but is relatively small numerically, which is technical help. This is help coding and doing math. You can see it used to be about 11%. Now it's down to 5%. That's not because it's shrinking. It's because all the other categories are growing so much more. And you can see the early adopters are much more coding intensive than the later usage. So when you look at these categories, what I see is actually most, and I'll show you more in the disaggregated categories, most ChatGPT usage is really just kind of mundane and wholesome. Not all of it. Okay, so 2%, if it's 2% relationships, that's still 2% out of a big number. There's a lot of people having strange personal conversations with ChatGPT, potentially strange personal conversations with ChatGPT, but that's not what it's mostly being used for. It's mostly just everyday help. Okay, so it's not like taking over the world, but it's also kind of practically useful. Okay, so this is usage at work. So one of the classifiers we trained is this message related to the user's employment or paid work? That's a difficult thing to ask, but we estimate in the paper overall that about 30% of messages are related to paid work, which is a pretty high number considering this is the consumer plan. Okay, so a lot of people are using it informally for work. And what you see is by far the most common work usage is writing. About 40% of all work messages are related to writing. Okay, and then you see the other categories there. Technical help is a higher share than it is for non-work. Okay, so these are all of the categories. Just to point out a few things here. Again, within writing, you can see the different subcategories. You see actually asking the model to write for you would be write fiction and personal writing or communication, and the other three are modifying existing text. You can see here that practical guidance, the 4 big categories are tutoring or teaching. That's 10% of all messages. So for the educators out there, 10% of 780 million weekly active users or 2.76 billion messages means there's an awful lot of messages being sent related to tutoring and teaching each day. How-to advice, like how to fix my garage door opener or, how to prove this theorem maybe, potentially. This is the workout routine thing. And then creative ideation is things like help me write a business plan, come up with a name for my fantasy football team or whatever. Okay. All right, anything else I want to say about that? And then you see there that 1.9% is relationships. Okay. All right. So another thing we do with ChatGPT is similar to what they do in the Anthropic Economic Index paper, which is to classify messages according to ONET work tasks. So ONET is a widely used survey administered by the US Department of Labor that basically classifies work into job tasks. And so here's what we find. Here's the classification of work-related ChatGPT messages into ONET tasks. And what we see is that actually messages are heavily concentrated in a small number of categories. And if you look at this is the top 10 in order, the full list is in the paper. But you can see the top 10 account for about half of all messages, and there's a very long tail. And when I look at this, what I see is 2 themes. One is obtaining, analyzing, synthesizing information. And the second one is what I would call decision support. So the second one is making decisions and solving problems. But then we've also got thinking creatively and things like that. So it's sort of like anything that helps you make a decision, but doesn't make the decision for you. So then we look at the top tasks and we ask how different are they by user occupation. So for a subset of our message data, we link it to third-party information, publicly available third-party information to try to figure out what is a user's occupation, education, things like that. And so what I'm showing you basically is those across the rows are those top categories. It's like the top 7 ONET work tasks, and then the ranking within each occupation group of those tasks. Okay, so for example, for managers, the top task is making decisions and solving problems. The second one is documenting and recording information, and so on. And what I want you to notice about this table is that it's not that different across occupations. So if you look at making decisions and solving problems, it's number 1 or number 2 in all of the occupations. And I found that very surprising. Because you might expect, for example, that in education, so teaching, you might expect the top task to be tutoring and teaching others. It's not. It's it's documenting and recording information and then making decisions and solving problems. So what this tells me, to my surprise, I'll admit, is that it's not that people are using ChatGPT for all kinds of work tasks, is that they're using it for the kinds of tasks that are used in all jobs. But it's actually a pretty narrow slice of tasks. It's not anything physical. It's not a lot of other things that are mental. It's analyzing and synthesizing information and decision support. But those things are valuable in basically every knowledge job, and so they show up at the top of all these lists. Okay, so I found that kind of surprising, but not after the fact, not ex post, only ex ante. Okay, so all right, so let me just, I only got a few minutes left, so maybe just say a couple things quickly about this. So one is, there's a separate question of how much the AI boom is already visible in data, and I won't show you all the results in the interest of time, but basically it is. So you see a big increase in STEM and data-intensive employment over the last decade that is kind of a run-up of investment in AI and investment in data centers and things like that. And then we've seen some creative destruction in retail and just a ton of private sector investment in AI. So like in some sense, AI has already affected the labor market, not because it's changed jobs because of the way people are using it, but because investments in it have changed. Let me just, you can just read that in the papers if you want. Let me just conclude. I want to talk a little bit about this paper by Eric Brynjolfsson and colleagues called Canaries in the Coal Mine, which is about the impact of AI in entry-level employment. And I want to put the results in context. Okay, so let me briefly explain what this is. This is one of the figures from their paper that they have a lot of figures that look like this. And what they're basically doing is using payroll data from ADP, which is a large payroll company, and they're creating an event study around the release of ChatGPT in November of 2022. And they're holding constant the companies themselves, and they're measuring the headcount of those companies before and after the release of ChatGPT to try to look at trends. So the idea is to say, how did the headcount of employees in occupation and age groups change around this threshold? This is their most striking finding. What you see is early career, so software developers between the ages of 22 and 25 experienced relatively large declines in headcount right after the release of ChatGPT, and there's not much pre-trend in that. And so this is the basis of the Canaries in the Coal Mine result: AI is killing entry-level jobs. So I want to point out three things about this. I don't want to say the result is wrong, but I think there's three important contextual points. First one is, these lines are striking, but it's important to remember they're not all the same size. They don't all represent the same number of workers. Okay, and so I don't know what the age distribution of software developers is, but let's assume it's uniform on age. What you've got is this category has 4 age groups in it, but this category, senior, has like 15 age groups in it, and mid-career has 9 age groups in it, and mid-career 1 has 6, and so on. So if you just do something simple, which is you take this number for all of them, and then you weight the categories by size, what you would get is a straight line up. Okay, so this argument is not that AI is killing software developer jobs, it's AI is somehow killing only age 22 to 25 jobs in any meaningful way, but not any others, and in fact is making them increase. Okay, so it doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's a very particular story. It's not a story that connects like, oh, AI is doing all the coding for you, unless you think it's only doing coding for the people below the age of 25 and not coding for other people. So it's a very nuanced story. So point number 2 is that this is also a labor demand story. So this says the demand for young software developers is decreasing. And Econ 101 suggests that when you have a demand shift, prices and quantities move in the same direction. Just do the shift here. See if I'm doing it right. And so for laborers, prices are wages and quantities are headcount. So this is the quantity. So the question is, are prices moving in the same direction? And the answer is no. Actually, they're moving up. So this is from their paper. What you see is over that same period, wages for young software developers are going up relative to trend, not down. Okay? And so that's kind of a funny story. It's actually more of a supply story. So what could be going on, I don't know. It could be actually that the headcount is decreasing because many of these young people are leaving to go work at small companies or startups, and so the price of their labor is actually being bid up when they stay, but a lot of them are leaving. Right? That would be a supply story. And that relates to my third point, which is that this is by construction, so this isn't an error in the design. They're looking at a constant sample of firms. But actually, if you look at past technological revolutions and disruptions, usually what you see is it's the incumbents who are suffering and don't know how to adjust. And usually small companies and startups really grow quickly. And we actually have seen a big boom in startup activity since the pandemic. This is work by John Haltewanger and colleagues showing that actually new business formation has surged after the pandemic. So what could be going on in this paper is that young people are leaving big companies to join startups to become the next Google or the next NVIDIA, as in the dot-com boom. Right? So I don't know if that's the case, that future research is required, but I just want to point out that this paper does not necessarily mean that the sky is falling for young software developers. In fact, I'm pretty skeptical of that narrative. And mainly I'm skeptical of that because one thing we find in the ChatGPT paper I didn't discuss is that usage is highly, highly, highly concentrated among young people. So half of all adult usage of ChatGPT occurs among people between the ages of 18 and 25. So what you would be saying is that the people who are by far the heaviest users of this technology are also the ones who are being harmed by it, which seems kind of weird and seems like a weird long-run story, certainly. Because if we think this is going to lead in the fullness of time to AI native companies, who's going to be running those companies? It's people who've been using AI for a long time, which is young people. So that story seems like a very short run story that doesn't fully fit together to me. It doesn't mean I know the answer, but I would be a little more skeptical of that narrative. That's it. Thanks a lot.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll have time for some questions.
Thank you. So great paper. Thank you very much. One question I had is, so you were looking at how much time is saved by using ChatGPT, but how much extra time is added? In other words, in customer service, it's very, short cycle, and obviously it's being used to burn through calls, and those are monitored. But with a lot of other occupations, it's different, and so you can have a lot of people basically spending more time.
Yeah, that's true. So it really turns on the question of whether people are accurately answering. So we could have added some options to say, oh, actually, I'm adding time. A decent share of people say they don't save any time with it. So it could be that maybe they're actually adding time, and we should be adding that back up, which would make our estimates go down. It's a good point. I don't know the answer. Yeah, it's a good one.
It's a suggestion.
Yeah. Good suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm going to pile on that because of what we saw in the manufacturing data looking at AI use in firms. We actually see a productivity loss in the short run. And so I'm a big fan of adding some questions where we could actually see, it wouldn't be top coded at 0 time saved. We could actually see potentially loss or adjustment or some insights into, in the usage data, is there any way to see whether folks are trying a use and it's sort of they're like stuck doing the same thing over and over again because they're not getting, so if they ask for help with writing but they stay on that specific question over and over again because it's not quite sticking?
Yeah, great question. So we have a prompt we call interaction quality, which basically codes the emotional valence of the conversation to see and you do actually see that the so part of the paper I didn't discuss was we distinguish between what we call asking conversations and doing conversations, which is doing is like, write this for me. Asking is asking for help or asking for questions. And the interaction quality for asking messages is much higher than doing. And that suggests that when you ask ChatGPT for an output, you're not always getting what you want. And so you're having a multi-round exchange with it about that, and that leads to worse interaction quality. So there is some evidence that the model is better at decision support than it is at creating things for you. We don't know if that's partly because this is the consumer plan. There's other products like Codex and things like that are maybe more optimized for doing. But for the consumer plan, we do see people, they like the asking output better. Yeah.
Could I just also piggyback that discussion about time savings? Because I feel like a really interesting question to add would be about whether other people's AI use is wasting my time. So, right, there's this concern about AI generated slop kind of being around, and people write code that almost works and looks like it works and then it breaks and those kinds of things. And you could imagine that there's sort of an externality that I'm imposing on other people, and if people have views on the magnitude of that, it would be really interesting.
Yeah, it's a great point. I'm skeptical we could elicit that in a survey, but we could. And it could go the other direction too. It could have positive externalities too. But it's a great point. And again, another reason to, I take this, not that, I shouldn't say take it with a grain of salt. I think it's a data point, and one should view it with some skepticism. And also, I'm kind of more interested in how the number moves more than the absolute number, like whether we're going to see more labor productivity savings self-reported over time or less is almost more interesting to me than whether the number is 33% or 23% or whatever. Yeah, but it's a great point. Yeah.
Thanks so much. And again, I know there's only so many questions you can ask around the time element, but you focus on duration and how much time is saved.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on the rhythm of work and the impact of generative AI and how it affects the rhythm and pace and so on of what people do, the frequency of the things they do, and things like time perception. So one thing you sometimes see with generative AI is generative AI will answer the question for you in 2 minutes, but you don't want to just show that you respond so quickly in 2 minutes. You want to pretend and give the impression you've thought and thought and thought. So you wait a day and then you send the answer that you had the same time yesterday.
Right. Although hopefully you expend less mental effort getting to that answer.
You go to the pub or wherever. But I'm just wondering, have you any thoughts on that as you look at the internal data? Is that something interesting or that you see?
Yeah, it is. It's that is a very interesting. You're sort of asking like, how does it change my workflow in ways that are like hard to capture with a sort of concrete question about time savings with AI. It's sort of like, how has AI changed my daily routine? That's a great question. We could think about adding something like that. I don't have any brilliant insights about what it would likely look like now. One thing I want to say is I think, one lesson I take from all this is that we're very much in partial equilibrium right now with it. There's a lot of adjustments, second-order adjustments, that could end up being more important in the long run that haven't happened yet. And so I would take any empirical result, mine included, on AI with a grain of salt at this point.
Okay, I'm going to take the prerogative for the last question here. So if I understood that your measure of time saving says you did these things with AI, if you had to do them, how long would it take?
Yeah.
And
how much longer?
How much longer? Yes. And so I guess I think of this, I'm wondering how much we've seen a change in the type of work. And so in particular, I'm sort of imagining I'm a new father. I'm starting to be like, oh, I don't really know anything about schools, right? But when I ask ChatGPT, I don't say like, check out this school that's near me. Is it any good?
Yeah.
I say like, check out all of the schools that are in these 3 neighborhoods, right? Which of them is better? Give me a whole bunch of information, right? So I ask way bigger questions. And this reminds me a lot of stuff that we see in the traditional economics of IT, right? Where it's like, actually, you give me 10 times as much computing, I only get a little bit of extra utility or production, right? Yeah. And so I might be doing a lot of that. I'm wondering how you've thought about that question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I guess the way I'd put it, I think is what you're saying, is that there's an impact of time savings on the things you're doing in both states of the world with and without AI, and then there's like, what do you do that you wouldn't have otherwise done with AI? And we can't really get at that with the question. The example I give is, my parents are getting older and they're thinking about moving into an assisted living facility, not now, but like at some point in the next few years. So I asked Deep Research to write me like a 20-page research paper reviewing all of the options in the New England area, gave them my family's budget, tell me about the pricing structure, like all this information. Now, I would not have written that paper on my own because it would take me weeks, but I would have done some search that wasn't nearly as good or comprehensive. And so the value of it is some mix of the time savings, which is a time savings. I spent less time on it, but I also got more in return. And there's a million other examples like that. And so we're not really measuring that with this survey. It's another limitation. Yeah. But it's very, very important to think about how to do it. We tried a lot to do some willingness to pay stuff, and I just wasn't confident. We put in a bunch of checks on these questions to make sure they were internally consistent and people understood what they were saying and could never get anything reliable. It doesn't mean other people can't, but I found I came away from that more skeptical of elicitation of willingness to pay than I was before. So anyway, that's another way to think about the value of the technology.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah.